So, we recently authored an article called A Funding System to Support Economic Growth in the Nations and Regions of the UK. And this was released on the day before the UK Prime Minister convened the first Council of Nations and Regions of the new UK government. So, what we've discussed is the proper funding of local and regional economic growth and development. And a link to the article and the report this was based on that we did for the Local Government Association. The link is in the comments on this video. We're going to start by saying the socio-economic challenges facing the UK's regions, nations, and localities are significant. We're going to need a big leap in government policy, a massive leap to begin to address these long-standing economic disparities and economic underperformance. And regional inequalities have worsened over the past 20 years with many. Now, the author and professor Phil McCann in 2016 wrote a fantastic book about the UK's regional economic performance, and he showed that the UK ranks behind Slovakia and the Czech Republic now when comparing interregional inequalities. In a recent article, I published a table with updated statistics from the OECD, and this shows that 8 out of 12 UK regions and nations have a GVA per worker lower than the worst performing former East German states. And this extends to productivity rates, where the difference between London and the other UK nations and regions is greater than between the states of West Germany and the former East Germany. On this map, we can also see the stark differences in GVA per head between local authority areas in the UK in 2022. So poor economic performance has stark long-term impacts. The proportion of children in relative poverty has risen in every city except Belfast and Basildon, and in-work poverty is up almost everywhere, as pointed out by the Centre for Cities in their Cities Outlook report in January 2024. So how much would it cost to address the scale of the regional challenge in the UK? Well, the Germans spent 1.1 trillion euros on reunification, which excludes social transfer payments, over a 30-year period. And in early 2024, we were talking about pots of money for local growth in the UK of between 4.7 and 5 billion pounds, which pales in insignificance. The UK 2070 Commission estimated that addressing regional inequalities would require an investment of £250 billion over 30 years. Funding for local and regional economic growth has been a patchwork quilt that is not agile to changing needs. Over the past decade, over £13 billion of funding has been provided for levelling up. We have 12 different funding streams. Over 400 bodies are recipients of this funding, encompassing over 350 local authorities, 21 county councils, 12 combined authorities, 27 local economic partnerships, and 11 free ports, and 22 other forms of partnerships and bodies. So there are a variety of funds, eligible uses, timescales of expenditure, and monitoring and claims processes. The towns deals, for example, were offered to 101 selected towns. The UK Shared Prosperity Fund was allocated to places based on a formula that's created in 2011-12 using statistics from that period to determine European funding allocations. Local growth funding is static and it's often out of date due to these allocations. And funding formulas are also designed to fail areas of need. The Northern Powerhouse recently published a paper that showed that Tees Valley, which is one of the most deprived regions of the UK, would lose its annual shared prosperity funding and a reduction of £37 per person per year if the funding formula was retained. So local growth funds are complex and changing, and they're short term. There's a quick turnaround in applications, funding lasts from 9 to 36 months, and central government expertise that supports this local grants and funding regime shifts. And in an environment with significant pressures on all local government resources, The result is underspend, and there's been significant underspend. As the March 2024 Public Accounts Committee report noted, as of September 2023, local authorities had been able to spend only 1.24 billion, or just over 10% of the promised 10.47 billion pounds from the government's three levelling up funds. It found that just 64 of more than 1,100 projects have so far been finished, while more than 80% of those due for completion in the month of March 2024 will miss that deadline. And this has been warned about before. The National Audit Office warned about underspend in 2023. Local growth funds have been predominantly capital funds, and these often lack flexibility. They're often constrained to being within a few years of expenditure. Anybody who's run or been involved in a capital project knows that their scheduling can be notoriously difficult to manage. And anybody knows that construction cost inflation has significantly affected capital projects. Local government faces capacity constraints and costs of bidding. A University of Sheffield study found that 75% of local authorities had to pay costs beyond those provided as part of growth funding. And they found that round one of the Levelling Up Fund, authorities spent £14.7 million on bids that were unsuccessful. And there's been a failure to install effective monitoring and evaluation. To date, the funds have had a limited evaluation, and we've only really seen evaluation plans emerge in 2022. And there's virtually no evaluation for local growth schemes between 2010 and 2018. And the lack of joined up thinking in Whitehall translates into funding silos in regions and localities. There's been a complete lack of joining up of central funds, including transport, local growth, and climate change. The local rural economic agenda had disappeared for many years and made a surprise reappearance a few years ago when the Rural England Prosperity Fund was bolted on to the Shared Prosperity Fund. Overall, local and regional growth funding has significantly decreased since 2008. During the first coalition government in 2010 to 2015, it was estimated that funding for local and regional economic development and regeneration was at about 1/3 of 2008 levels. By 2022, the government planned to spend even less on English regional development than previous Conservative governments, despite levelling up being a flagship policy. I think probably the greatest issue is that up to June 2024, the UK government seemed to have learnt nothing from past policy. We'd seen it all before. Competitive grant funds in the 1980s and 1990s didn't make enough of an impact and were too disparate and in silos to enable integrated place-based solutions. This led to the integration of funding into single pots in the 1990s and 2000s. So it's clear we need to start learning from the past. As the National Audit Office further commented in 2023, there is significant scope for the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities to improve its understanding of what has worked well in previous local growth programmes. And the department could do more to assess whether individual policies had their intended impact. Overall, when we think about local growth funding, it really reflected the state of national government between 2015 and 2024, over a decade. Now, we have a 10-point plan at the end of this video for the future of funding for local economic development and growth. But if we look at the state of government over the decade, it was characterised by policy drift and ad hoc solutions and decisions, a lack of clear national government policy. We saw things like poor levels of trust and capacity, a lack of knowledge about local government powers, capacities, and assurance and audit procedures. And there was no priority and very little funding to build operational expertise. There were many abandoned policies, such as the UK industrial strategy, abandoned before it even had a chance to bed in and start delivering. Comprehensive spending review periods bear no real relation to economic cycles or the timelines of national infrastructure projects. There's been a massive implementation gap. If we look at the Levelling Up white paper, it had sky-high ambitions, but insufficient resources and almost zero delivery planning. And we have government silos based on departments, capital spending, revenue spending, CSR periods. Whereas we all know place-based growth and solutions require joined up funding and joined up policies and solutions. And there's no subsidiarity system that follows the principle of finding the right scale and administrative level for the highest impact and the best administrative level to make decisions. And we can see that in the devolution settlements that we have. They're all ad hoc, they're all different, the geographies are all different, there is no real logic behind them. So, looking to the future constructively, hopefully on Friday, the UK government will set out a national agenda, which includes clear policy objectives, trust and capacity building, stability and continuity, white papers with credible delivery plans and budgets to restore the cities and local growth unit or create other similar joining up initiatives, a clear and rational subsidiarity arrangements, clear devolution arrangements, a toolkit for devolution that localities can draw down on. And we need to think more about the system for economic growth as much as the projects and activities that get funded. There's been little thought to the machinery of government over the past decade. It's been all about funding projects on the ground. But we need the capacity and capability to both design and create, monitor and evaluate these projects, and also implement them to deliver them. And we need this over the long term. So we need multiple ingredients for success and a system that looks like this diagram here. So our 10-point plan for the future of local growth funding. To realise effective local and regional economic growth and development and address the long-standing disparities in economic performance between the UK's nations and regions, the UK government should 1. Set out a clear national economic policy that articulates the role of local economies and devolution. 2. Match resources and delivery mechanisms to the scale of challenges and opportunities. 3. Long-term challenges and opportunities require long-term solutions, which means a funding commitment of at least 20 years and funding cycles of 6 to 8 years or more. 4. Build the operational capacity and capability to deliver long-term local and regional economic growth. 5. Provide capital funding that aims for quality, need, opportunity, impact, and a more predictable funding pipeline. 6. Provide a bigger role for fixed allocations, but retain a better designed competitive funding system where appropriate. 7. Design funding mechanisms that promote partnership working and relationship building between tiers of government and stakeholders. 8. Encourage match funding and leverage where suitable, and this can improve impact. 9. Design a funding system that builds in efficiency and impact. And finally, 10. Establish processes and compliance that are clear and uniform and supported with training, and use existing fit-for-purpose approaches that don't duplicate or recreate approaches to monitoring compliance that already exist. So hopefully some of these points will be addressed on Friday, the 11th of October at the Nations and Regions Summit. I must thank my co-authors of the report, which this video is based on, all of our collective thoughts. We've got almost 100 years of experience in local and regional economic development between us. I must thank Mike Spicer, who runs Policy Department, and Professor Pete Tyler from the University of Cambridge. Okay, thanks. I hope that was useful. And let's look forward to improved policies for local and regional economic development in the future.